Coming up on the Threat Status podcast, we talk to Cliff Beek, an entrepreneur and leader in the futuristic world of space infrastructure. He takes us across the fast-evolving intersection between space and business. We've also got Threat Status and Washington Times correspondent Bill Gertz on the show this week to walk us through the political purges and corruption rocking the Chinese People's Liberation Army. We'll also discuss the latest on President Trump's Golden Dome missile shield, and we'll take careful stock of whether or not the delicate U.S Iran ceasefire is going to hold or collapse over the coming days and weeks. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status podcast. I'm Guy Taylor, national security editor here at the Washington Times. I'm hosting this week's episode, which we're taping on the afternoon of Thursday, April 9th. National security correspondent Ben Wolfgang is away this week, so I'm actually very lucky to have Bill Gertz as my partner on the show this week. Worry not, Ben Wolfgang will be back hosting next week's episode from the floor of the 2026 Space Foundation Space Symposium in Colorado Springs, so be sure to tune in for that. But for this week, as you probably already know, Bill Gertz is the senior national security journalist here at the Times and on the Threat Status team. It's great to have him. He's a mentor of mine, has been for a long time. We work very closely together. Week to week, day to day, often hour to hour. His main coverage area is the Indo-Pacific, with a really specific focus on China and security and intelligence threats emanating from the Communist Party-controlled government in Beijing. Bill, thanks for joining this week. We've got a lot to talk about. I'm going to assess the U.S. Iran conflict in a few minutes. But first, Bill Gertz, what's on your radar now? I know you just filed this afternoon a story about some things that Xi Jinping has said that have made headlines. Walk us through it.
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Guy. I just filed a story. It's on the Washington Times website, and the headline is Xi Jinping urges brass to remain pure and communist. Basically, the supreme leader of China, who holds three positions, president, chairman of the Central Military Commission, and party general secretary, gave a speech at the National Defense University to the top leadership of the People's Liberation Army. And this speech basically said that the military leadership has to remain so-called pure as part of what he called a political rectification campaign. This is a campaign it's a euphemism for basically political conformity. And this is why the PLA has commissars at every level of the armed forces to enforce that this is really not a national army like the U.S. military or the French military or the Japanese military. It's a party army. And it's been rocked by massive corruption scandals that are really a front for political purges. And the reason is, according to a senior defense official who briefed me some months ago, corruption is endemic, but Xi Jinping basically fears his top military commanders. He fears that they're going to usurp his power and basically undermine his rule. It's an important story in the sense that there's this massive purge going on. 36 of the top leaders, and including most of the Central Military Commission generals and admirals, have been forced out.
Do you think there's a particular thing that Xi Jinping fears with disloyalty? Is it a particular policy? Does it have to do with China military policy towards Taiwan or towards the United States? Or is it really just that he's trying to do this corruption purge?
Well, there is corruption, and here's how the corruption worked. For decades, people who wanted to be promoted within the PLA had to pay the senior officer ahead of them to get promoted. So he's first of all trying to fix that. There have been, I would say, a decade or at least a decade of people who have bought their promotions. And again, that makes them not loyal to Xi Jinping, but loyal to the PLA commander above them.
Mm,
Secondly, there was a major incident that took place in 2012
mm,
involving a regional Communist Party chief named Bo Xilai.
mm,
And Bo Xilai bragged, he's now in prison, maybe dead, but he bragged that he had an entire PLA group army under his personal control. So
mm.
this was 2012, right when Xi Jinping came into power, and that's really affected his fear of the military usurping his authority. And everything he's done since 2012 has been to consolidate his power. He's the most powerful leader since Mao Zedong.
Is there a connection to the military's preparedness or readiness to potentially try and militarily take Taiwan?
You know, this is a big debate among China analysts, and it's one I follow closely.
Mm,
A lot of people say, oh, how can the PLA have any kind of capabilities and readiness to do military operations? But the reality is, when you look at the hardware that's being cranked out, they're producing submarines and warships. They're cranking
mm,
them out like sausage. 5 to every 1 or 2 that the
mm,
U.S. puts out.
mm,
And so there's been real no diminution in their forces capability.
mm,
And I would argue that rather than weakening the military, these kinds of purges are actually strengthening the
mm,
military. And they're focused on this, what's been called the Davidson window. That's for the previous Indo-PACOM commander, Admiral
mhm,
Philip Davidson, who
mm,
said that, who revealed in congressional testimony that the Chinese were ordered to be ready to take Taiwan by next year.
mm.
And of course, this has become a big debate as well, whether they're actually going to go. And I think a lot of the thinking is that they will go, that there
Mm.
is that opportunity.
Every time you see anything come out of Beijing and Chinese propaganda about Taiwan, there's always this idea or this other camp that says that the CCP wants to take control of Taiwan without using force. I think there's another development this week, right? And it had to do with the CCP's efforts to kind of sow political discord inside Taiwan by supporting opposition factions there. Obviously, Taiwan is a U.S. aligned democracy. It's interesting, Bill, that Taiwan's top opposition leader, Cheng Li-won, visited Beijing in recent days at the invitation of Xi Jinping. And that visit was actually the first in, I think, a little bit more than a decade by a Taiwanese opposition leader. It comes at this interesting time in the lead up to this likely Trump Xi summit next month in China, the diplomacy of which is kind of being shaped by tension over Taiwan. So I just want to point that out. I mean, what did you think of that visit by the Taiwanese opposition?
Yeah, this is a very interesting development. It's part of what the pundits and wags call the theology of Taiwan.
Mm,
The issue of Taiwan involves the KMT, which is the Nationalist Party, which fled the mainland in 1949 during a civil war. And they believe that they are the legitimate rulers of China.
mm,
And the DPP, Democratic Progressive
yeah,
Party, is much more Taiwan centric. They
mm,
believe that Taiwan is a separate nation. And these two forces, the Chinese Communist Party is playing on those divisions. They'd like to defeat Taiwan without firing a shot under the ancient strategist Sun Tzu. But basically, the new KMT leader who went to Beijing is much more pro-Beijing. And I'm
mm,
sure that this is a reflection of massive Chinese influence operations to
mm,
influence the KMT to really seek what they called the one country, two systems model, which of
mm.
course was totally shot down when they sought to do the same thing in Hong Kong, which is now totally taken over by communist China.
Interesting. Let's pivot for a second because you have actually been very prolific this past week. 2 days ago, you had a story drop where you dug into Trump's Golden Dome next generation missile defense shield for the American homeland plan. What did you get in that story? What's your main takeaway right now with Golden Dome?
Well, yeah, most of the Golden Dome program has been wrapped in secrecy.
I
And
know. Yeah.
obviously, this is part of the Pentagon's doesn't want anybody to know what they're doing. The
Right.
best leak on this took place, I think, in January at a Huntsville conference where actual slides from a defense contractor were made public through a couple wire services. Anyway, my story was basically an update what's going on with Golden Dome. And the news hook for that was that the White House recently, the Office of Management and Budget released the first framework outline details of the fiscal 2027 defense budget, which is going to be a record $1.5 trillion. This is like a massive increase of defense spending. And as part of those documents, they revealed that the Golden Dome missile defense system will get $17 billion, and that's on top of some 27 odd additional funds for a total of about 39 billion. And then they outlined the Air Force is getting this, the DARPA is getting this, the Missile Defense Agency is getting that, and it was quite extensive. And then I leveraged an important speech that was given last month by General Gutlein, who is the designated general in charge of Golden Dome, and he revealed quite a few details a little bit. Again, he was mostly guarded in what he was talking about, but my takeaway from his remarks there was that Golden Dome is, quote, off and running, he said, and that the highest risk will be in the space-based interceptor realm. This is, he said they've had a lot of successful tests, no failures so far, which is pretty important progress. This idea of developing space-based interceptors is going to be a revolutionary missile defense technology.
All very insightful and interesting, Bill. Listeners, hopefully will go check out your story or any of your stuff. They can basically just Google Bill Gertz stories, Washington Times. You come up with everything there. For my own part, I'm closely watching whether this really delicate Iran-U.S. ceasefire holds through the weekend here. As we tape this episode on the afternoon of April 9, there seems to be real risk that ongoing Israeli strikes targeting Iran-backed Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanon could derail the ceasefire. Iranian officials say they thought the ceasefire with Trump covered Lebanon. Israel apparently thought otherwise. Or it's just pushing the envelope there. We saw Vice President J.D. Vance saying the U.S. never said Lebanon was part of the ceasefire. My point here, Bill, is that there's just a lot of confusion about who's in the driver's seat on this entire ceasefire narrative. The Pakistanis acted as a back channel for Iranian and Trump administration officials to reach the ceasefire. It's not totally clear what the terms are. Trump has said he thinks China convinced the Iranians to join in negotiations. There's just a great deal of uncertainty, and we're going to continue to cover it closely in the Daily Threat Status newsletter. With that, Bill, I want to get to our feature interview with Cliff Beek. Ben Wolfgang and I pre-taped. So even though Ben is away today, you are going to hear his voice introducing the interview with Cliff Beek in just a moment.
And we are joined now by Cliff Beek, an entrepreneur who has worked in the space and telecommunications industries for decades. Cliff is now the CEO of SC Solutions and the co-founder of Modern Pay Engine, and really is at the cutting edge of space and business, which is why Cliff is here today to talk about the space economy and specifically financial transactions in space, which is something that honestly, Cliff, I hadn't thought a lot about until we met recently. And I find it fascinating and hope the audience does as well. So thanks for coming on the Threat Status podcast.
Thanks, Ben. My pleasure to be here. And you're absolutely right. A lot of people do not think about that layer of the space industry. Up until recently, I mean, most people are thinking about the space economy in three layers. It's the launch, the satellite, and then the data relay. But as space begins to reach a trillion-dollar industry, there's a fourth layer that's evolving, and that is the one that I'd like to talk about with you is the orbital rails in space.
Yeah, well, as far as that $1 trillion, I mean, what are we talking about here? What kinds of business is going to be conducted in space? What does that actually mean when we say the space economy? What's it going to look like?
Man, I don't know if you saw last week what was announced by NASA, the lunar base camp, what they're looking to build. It's no longer just exploration. It's more like building an operating economy because I think it was Carlos Garcia Galan laid it out beautifully. I mean, he did it in phases. About the first phase was not so much just going like what they're doing, I think, today or tomorrow, God willing, they get their launch done, is revisiting the sort of the lunar orbital plane. But in the near future, they're starting to build out actual, a base camp where there'll be sustainability for humans and for autonomous services. So that economy layer is going to be autonomous services. There's going to be, occupants on the lunar surface, mining, providing services back and forth. So there's going to be a huge amount of business being conducted in space. Most of it would be around, I would think, those very early stages of building some kind of environment that life can be sustained so that they can do all these different kinds of exploration activities out there.
So what does that mean? Just kind of setting it up so there's people have access to water, for example, or to make sure that there's places where people can sleep, just kind of the basics of life and doing business in that environment.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's some pretty interesting concepts that are being passed around. But NASA's talking about, this ESOM or ISOM, which is the servicing, manufacturing, and developing assembly in space. So you're going to need to have those sort of just primary elements there. But at the same time, we think about, power, communications, the ability to create a GPS system. So launching small satellites in the lunar atmosphere that could provide guidance for a GPS system. There's a lot of interesting things that's going to occur in this next decade. So from what I think about what's happening in the next 5 years, as I mentioned, it's less pure exploration and it's more like an operating economy. And those will include, the next 10 years will include regular commerce, logistics, servicing, manufacturing in orbit. So beyond that, I think orbit becomes a true industrial layer of the economy with money transacting and contracts and settlement systems. They'll be needing to move there too.
One more quickly, Guy's going to jump in here with a question to kind of drill down on that specifically, but one more big picture, Cliff. You're following this as closely as anybody. Which industries do you think are kind of positioning themselves correctly to take advantage of this, and maybe which might not be, or at least not yet? Energy and minerals. You mentioned mining. I would imagine those are folks that have their eyes, pretty trained on this pretty closely. Finance, telecommunications. What other sectors of the economy, as we know it here on Earth, are best positioning themselves right now to take advantage of this when it starts happening?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't really thought about that as deeply as I do on the transaction side for the financial rails, but I would think that these would be manufacturers capable of building and 3D printing on the lunar surface, where you need to be able to have a launch vehicle ready to come back to Earth or ready to go to another,
Meaning you don't need to get parts or replacement parts shipped to the lunar surface. You can 3D print that stuff right there. Yeah.
It's got to be done there, including, the ability to launch a satellite or launch a recovery node from the lunar surface. So from my perspective, we've already seen from the payment side, from the which companies should be there. I would think it's like, again, it's your launch services, your manufacturing. You mentioned mining. Mining is one that is of interest, but purely for sustainability. I look at, someone was asking me, well, what is the sort of core commodity for payments? Well, it's not an original idea, but suppose that you're producing kilowatts of power. So for each unit of power you produce, it's worth some value for some type of an exchange of buying another asset to service an in-orbit component. So the underlying currency may not be what we're thinking about today, but it's maybe a lunar unit could be a kilowatt of power. And as you produce that, you're getting rewarded for it. We've already demonstrated, that we can put transactional nodes into orbit. As Space Chain, we've put two of them at the International Space Station. We've had 7 successful launches.
All right, Cliff, this is Guy Taylor. This is my mind is a little bit blown, and this happens occasionally in these situations. So, who owns the mineral on Mars or on the moon that's ultimately being mined? I mean, that doesn't who owns it? Doesn't that ultimately impact the monetary value of what is mined?
Jurisdictional control, and that's a good question. I think it's like, many companies are preparing to be in a position to safely control those elements. I mean, we've seen the Chinese who are up there. They've landed. It appears there's a big focus on the south pole of the lunar surface. That appears to be where NASA and other groups are focusing. There are some large craters where there's ice available. There's ice, signs of ice, and there's capacity for producing water and oxygen. But who owns it? I mean, that's the question, and I think right now it's open to a lot of various ideas about how we sort of maintain control over it. Like, so I'm not one for I'm one for clear licensing and ownership of assets and settlements, but I don't want to see that this is sort of like, over-regulated and creating a impractical framework that allows, responsible commercial activity. But, I guess ownership becomes possession, and, who's in possession of it.
I mean, I want to ask it as a national, and maybe I think you're right for this. I don't want to pull you out of your lane totally, but why is it important for the U.S. to be a leader in developing the technology and the systems that are going to undergird everything we're talking about here? We focus on national security and threat status all the time in our newsletter, in the weekly podcast, most of our videos. What is your view, Cliff, of U.S. adversaries? China, is China pushing to dominate this space, and we're just not even talking about it? I mean, we brought it up a little bit here. Why does this matter? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's extremely important and vital, because whatever we do in space on the lunar surface does spill over to here at home. So, for example, I think Americans benefit quite a bit from our ability to push forward at the technology and create these economic zones. I feel that, it creates more jobs, it creates a lot of opportunities here on Earth, but the capability to be in a position to safely secure the lunar surface and areas of space is really important for our security and for the growth of our for life here on Earth. I mean, it creates stronger disaster responses. It creates newer technologies. It creates industries and jobs on Earth. If space becomes a real economic zone, then the financial systems that need to support it obviously have to create this new investment for manufacturing and technology spillovers here at home. But it's just the reality of what's going on in space. And I feel that it's incredibly important for the U.S. and for us not to militarize it, but to have a presence there to be able to develop the kind of technologies that will move us forward. I mean, a lot of the technology that we get from our mobile devices and from a lot of the things that we work at came out of, work that was done for NASA and work that was done for, NSA and other entities. So the secure element of how we live on Earth and here in the U.S. is really important.
You just had this phrase come in that it's so important for the U.S. to be there, but also not to militarize it. I had an interview with General Chance Saltzman, the commander of the U.S. Space Force, inside the Pentagon, that's on the threat status pages. It was a video piece about 2 months ago, and he went to lengths to talk about things that specifically China and Russia have done to militarize space, and that the U.S. is in this kind of responsive posture at this point, almost catching up. And I'd want to just drill into that idea of not to militarize it, because my question to you is, like, is there actually an opportunity here the way that to look at space the way that the great powers used to look at the Arctic, which is it's so austere. We need to work together scientifically, or are we already on a footing of sort of hype with what some academics would call hyper competition? We're already going into this sort of competitive, and perhaps that hyper competition is even driving some of the innovation. What are your thoughts there?
Well, you actually called me out on that. I mean, I tend to look at what was going on in space. The reality of it is militarized. I mean, when we look at all the various components of having situational awareness, which satellites coming towards you to maybe try and deorbit one of your strategic military assets. I've sat in various agencies' offices and looking at their boards and how they've drawn this up, and it's all about. There's a high percentage of the conversation about reactive and defensive, the playbook, and the satellite infrastructure is really predominant in any kind of warfare activity, and I'm all about being very my background, it came out of encryption and security and those things. When I mentioned it, you kind of called me out. It's like, wouldn't it be nice if we could just explore space together? But unfortunately, the reality of it's a dangerous world, and we need to have a focused view on what is actually happening. And so, yeah, I mean, there is that element that comes out of Space Force and other agencies that we have, and I'm very respectful of that. And I know that it's a requirement and the reality of life.
Cliff, you mentioned Space Force, and that this kind of got me thinking here about who's going to govern all the stuff that we're talking about here, including the financial transactions and the business that's being done in space. I mean, we don't have a Department of Space, a civilian-led Department of Space yet in the U.S. I mean, off the top of my head, I mean, it sounds like you can make a case that the Pentagon, the State Department, Commerce, Treasury, Energy, OSHA, the EPA, and a whole bunch of other arms of the government would have a reasonable claim to certain pieces of what we're talking about here. So who ends up responsible for all this?
I mean, again, I don't want to see it to be overregulated, but there probably is interplay between, I mean, just think about transactional communications coming back to Earth. I mean, the FCC, NASA, NOAA, Treasury, Office of Space Commerce, so not to overregulate, but all of that. I mean, the jurisdiction of this, at least for the U.S. side of it, needs to have a new playbook written, and they need to be aware of it. But again, when you are talking about communicating, you have spectral licenses for communicating, not communications, not to interfere with other activities that are, defense, commerce. So there needs to be a clear lane of regulation, and it just can't be open. So I see it as being, FAA, FCC, NASA, NOAA, Treasury, Office of Space Commerce, So, but the key is from my perspective is not to overregulate it, but to create a practical framework that allows for responsible commercial activity to scale safely.
Last thing, Cliff, this can probably, I hesitate to bring this up last because we could probably this could be an entire 20-minute interview on its own, but I'm just curious where you come down on the potential new security vulnerabilities this could open up. I mean, we're all familiar with things like cyber attacks on Earth or major companies being hacked or key infrastructure becoming targets for adversaries. Are there new types of cybersecurity measures that are going to need to be put in place to protect space-based businesses, space-based financial transactions? I mean, are the things that we're using on Earth sufficient for that? Do we even know what's sufficient? Where's everybody looking as far as security for all this stuff goes in space?
Yeah, so I'm looking at it more from, aside from the transactional financial rails that are required, and that a lot of companies aren't even thinking about the financial rails, and at least not yet. But I do feel that the companies that are thinking about it and working on it today, like Modern Pay Engine, will be in a better position to sort of, conduct commerce in the future. But the physical assets, in terms of the ability to have situational awareness in space, how do you know that you're getting a signal from a ground station that's telling you from a rogue, adversary to deorbit one of your satellites, or the physical threat of being able to look at what's coming towards you and having the appropriate sensors? So situation awareness in space is going to be extremely important so that you have the ability to decipher between friend, foe, and which communication channel am I receiving. Private key distribution for autonomous vehicles and autonomous interaction. We need to make sure that those communications, that where they're getting their instructions from is actually who they think they're getting them from. When you see, again, when you're not visually seeing it, but when you're able to detect a physical asset coming towards one of your satellites or one of your, infrastructure, is that who you think it is? So visual awareness and the sensors that are going to be required and I would think it's more for creating a situational awareness in space, visual, and being able to identify, like on a payload, origin of where that's coming from is going to be really, really important. And there are companies out there today that are working on that. I've had some conversations with these young entrepreneurs who are building the capability to identify objects in space very clearly. So, in my opinion, that is the most important thing. Is we looked at Earth observation satellites from the past, who really worked really hard for getting spectral and hyperspectral images. That in orbit requirement is going to be just fine-tuned so that you'll be able to determine, who's communicating with you, who's coming towards you, and is this a threat or what the situation is. So situational awareness in space is going to be incredibly important.
Cliff Beek, thanks so much for coming to the Threat Status Podcast. Really enjoyed that.
Ben, my pleasure, Guy. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here on the show where we identify a global security threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting or could impact U.S. national security. Bill, what do you have as your threat of the week?
Guy, my threat of the week has to do with one of the hottest flashpoints on the planet, and that's the Taiwan Strait, the 100-mile waterway separating Taiwan from the mainland that has been the scene of intense military activity and provocations by the People's Liberation Army. Just recently, the Chinese government announced an unusual 40-day air closure of some 340 miles along the Chinese coast.
Kind of unprecedented.
Yes. In the past, similar air closures were announced for 1 or 2 days for relatively either missile firings or military exercises, of which there have been many. The experts I talked to said, and this is in my latest Inside the Ring column, you can catch on the Washington Times and also through Threat Status. This is something that people say is going to be the announcement that some major military exercises are coming, or perhaps even the final balloon going up on a military assault on Taiwan. Everyone's always watching closely for those warning signs, and this to me is the biggest threat area that the U.S. is facing, because basically we have a strong ally in Taiwan, and any kind of assault by the Chinese on Taiwan would have devastating implications for the world economy and U.S. allies in the region.
Thanks for that, Bill. My own threat of the week is short and simple, but also complex. And it's really the threat that this U.S. Iran ceasefire is not going to hold. Essentially that the Iranians are going to miscalculate, and they're going to conclude that Trump is bluffing, and the result will be a major escalation that we all had feared, an escalation that results in even higher global fuel prices, potentially shifting great power geopolitics, and just more dangerously brings humanity teeteringly close to world war. I hope it doesn't happen, Bill, but that's my threat of the week. With that, a huge thanks to you, Bill Gertz, for joining me on the show this week. And an even bigger thanks, actually, to Cliff Beek for being the featured interviewee on this week's episode. And the biggest thanks of all to you, our listeners. Please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, share the podcast with all of your friends. And a reminder, we will be delivering next week's episode from the Space Foundation's 2026 Space Symposium. Thanks so much again from our team here at the Threat Status Podcast.